Okay, dear teachers of Uzbekistan who are from different regions are now watching us through Zoom, and those who have some bad internet connection, we have streaming this in YouTube and sent the links to them as well. We welcome you to our second session of TKT course by Alan Pulvernes and his colleague Chris Ross. And we would like to thank once more for opportunity for arranging by our partners, NILE, and here at Innovative Center and LPA, Language Popularization Agency under the Cabinet Minister of Republic of Uzbekistan. We would like to thank all of our partners who facilitated this webinar. Now I'd like to give turn to Chris Ross, and I will be very happy if you make 20 seconds quick introduction about yourself as well, because it's your first time making a webinar. So I would like to give stage to Chris. Go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. Or I believe it's afternoon where you are. It's morning here where I am. My name is Chris Rose. I am a colleague of Alan Pulvernes's, who I've worked with for a long time. I am a writer and a teacher trainer. I work with NILE, the Norwich Institute for Language Education, as an associate tutor there. I'm also the Royal Literary Fund Fellow at the University of Manchester Library. I've been teaching English for about 25 years now. I've lived and worked in many different countries, and I've lived in the UK for the last 10 years. I've taught TKT with Alan in a number of countries in the UK and a number of countries abroad. So that's me. I hope you're all well this afternoon, or well today. Here's what we're going to do for the next hour. Our session today is about lexis, an interesting word which we'll think a little more about in a moment. First of all, I'd just like to ask you some introductory questions. What do we know already? Okay, these are 3 questions. They're just for fun, just to get us thinking about the issues that we're going to be looking at over the next hour. So my first question is a very big question. It's how many words are there in English? Have a think to yourself. How many words do you think there are in the English language? Let's just have a quick think. Okay. Let me tell you the answer to this question, and you can check to see if you were correct. It's a difficult question to answer, really, because the true answer is that nobody really knows exactly how many words there are in the English language. Somebody said here about 100,000, which is not a bad guess, but there are actually a lot more than 100,000. If we include, as I say, nobody really knows because we don't have one book or one database that records all the words in English, but people who study these things and say that if we include all the scientific and technical terms, there are probably about 1 million words in English. That's quite a lot of words, but don't worry, we don't need to know 1 million words. This leads on to my next question. Again, see if you can answer this one for yourself. What's the most common word in English? That is, out of all those 1 million words, which is the one word that we use the most? Have a think. Have a think. Well, let me tell you, the most commonly used word in English is the word "a." "A." The indefinite article, a very, very small word. Now, that's quite interesting, and it makes the point that even though there may be 1 million words in English, the words that we use every day are these very ordinary, very simple, very small words. And this leads on to my third warm-up question here. Out of all those 1 million words, how many words do most people know? When I say most people here, I'm thinking about a typical, let's say, a native speaker of English, somebody who grew up speaking the language and speaks English every day. How many do we know? The answer here might surprise you. As I said, even though there are possibly 1 million words in English, most people, even people like me who work with English every day, a foreigner maybe knows about 5,000 words. Okay, it's a suggestion here. We'll come to that in a second. That's a good answer. A native speaker knows, it's difficult to say. Again, there are different studies, but it's probably somewhere in between 30 and 40,000 words. Probably more like 30,000. But that's at a passive level. Now, here's an important point. There's a difference between what we call our passive vocabulary and our active vocabulary. Our passive vocabulary are all those words that we recognize when we see them written down or hear them spoken. We know them, but we don't produce them. We don't use them. In our active, everyday vocabulary, we only use somewhere probably around about 5,000 words. So out of that 1 million words, 5,000 are the only words that we use every day in our typical spoken and written active vocabulary. So that's not that many. The suggestion there was that a foreigner might know, or a non-native speaker might know about 4,000 words, which is great. That's a good lot of words. That will certainly help you. I think perhaps it depends what level you are and how long you've been studying English and how often you use English. But many learners of English or non-native speakers will, at a passive level, know a lot more than that. We'll possibly know about 10,000 words. So let's think more carefully about words and what it means to know a word. Here's what we're going to do today. Okay, we're going to try and look at 5 things in the next 40 minutes. Firstly, we're going to think about what a word is, because we might think we know what a word is, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. So that's the first thing we're going to do. Then we're going to look at different kinds of meaning. Again, this is something that might seem simple on the surface. A word means something, a word has a meaning. We're going to think about how words convey or express or communicate a meaning in different ways. Then we're going to look at the different forms words can have, the way they are written, the way they are spoken. And we're going to look about the useful groups we can put words into. So we can think about perhaps not 1 million words, perhaps not even 30,000 words, but at least those 5,000 to 10,000 words, and think how we can group them to make life easier for us as teachers and for our students. And then finally, towards the end of the hour, we're going to think quickly about ways we can teach Alexis and the most important things that we need to keep in mind when we're teaching vocabulary words. Okay, so firstly, let me just clarify this term Lexis. Sometimes it's said that we use too many complicated words and keep it simple. So why do we have a word Lexis when there are other perfectly good words, vocabulary, or just words? Lexis might be a fancy term for words, but words are important. Words are the building blocks of the language. You can know everything about grammar, but if you don't know any words to put into that grammar, it's useless. You can study phonetics for years, but if you don't know any words to wrap around those sounds, it's useless. Words are the building blocks of language. I like words. Words are important, I think. Lexis is sometimes called, we sometimes hear this term, a lexical item, which again, isn't quite the same thing as a word. For example, get is a word, yeah, just one word. It exists on its own. But to make it mean something, we have to make it part of a lexical item. So to get up is 3 words, but 1 lexical item, as is to get down or to get over something or to get on with something. Get, that word, which is a very common word in English, can have different meanings depending on the other words that it's with. So this is why the 3 words here or the 4 words become what we call a lexical item, or even to get the hump about something, which is a nice idiom, which we're going to look at later. Collocations, thank you. Oh, this is a really interesting idea. We're going to look at collocations and chunks and word groups when it comes up later. Yeah, collocations are great things. We'll come to that again in a second. Thank you for anticipating that. Okay. Meaning, obviously, words are there to communicate meaning. Language is all about communication and expressing meaning. There are 2 types of meaning, however, or for our purposes, let's think about 2 types of meaning. One, the first one is what is called the denotative meaning. This is perhaps the dictionary definition, let's say. For example, I have my phone here, and if I want to give a definition of a phone, you would say a electronic tool to aid communication over distance. That's what a phone would be. Here I have a pen, a very simple object. A pen, you could be a tool for writing using ink. That's the denotative meaning, a definition of what something is. However, words also have a connotative meaning. This is the suggestion or what is communicated to us by the idea of something. Let me give an example here. What we have here quite clearly is a tree. We know what a tree is. If I wanted to have the denotative meaning of tree, it would be a living organism made of wood and leaves, which can live for a long time or something. I don't know. I'm not a walking dictionary, but it will be something like that. A very clear explanation of what a tree is. However, we also use the word tree in English to make expressions like, for example, the tree of life. Or we will talk, it is a plant, it is indeed a plant. Yes, thank you. We also use expressions in English like the tree of life to talk about how all living organisms on the planet are connected. If you learn about your ancestors, if you learn about your grandfathers and grandmothers, and then your great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers, and you write them all down on a piece of paper, this is what we call a family tree. Your family tree is all your when you list all your ancestors. So if we talk about a family tree, obviously we're using some of the ideas of a tree, the roots, the leaves, the branches, something which goes on for a long time and grows, but we're not talking about an actual plant, are we? So that would be an example of connotative meaning, when something is suggested by metaphor or association. Meaning denotative, connotative. Next slide. Okay, now one of the other ways of establishing meaning very clearly is thinking about the parts of speech. Every word in terms of grammar has a function, doesn't it? It has something that it does. It's a noun, a verb, an adjective, an article, a preposition, adverb, a conjunction, some others. It's a naming thing, a noun. It's a doing, it's an action, it's a motion word, a verb. It's a word which describes something. It's a word which defines something, it's a word that tells us where something is or where it's going, a preposition, place or time. It's a word which describes how we do something, an adverb, or it's a conjunction, a word which puts parts of sentences together, and, but, this, after, and so on. Okay, it's very useful to, when we're trying to establish the meaning of a word or talk about the meaning of a word, to think about what part of speech it is. The important thing to remember in English, of course, is that some words, quite a lot of words, can be more than one part of speech. Grammatical meaning. Yeah, this is sometimes called, if we think about it this way, this is sometimes called lexical grammar. As an aside, sometimes we think of grammar and vocabulary being separate things, and for a learner that can be a useful distinction to make. We've got grammar over here, vocabulary over here, but grammar and vocabulary obviously are two parts of the same thing, and this is what we sometimes call lexical grammar. Parts of speech. How do we communicate meaning to our students when we want to tell them what things mean? 3 good ways of establishing meaning. One is this term realia, which I'm sure you'll come across again in this TKT course. Realia is quite simply using the thing itself. That is, if a student says to me, please teacher, what is a notebook? I can simply say, there, this is a notebook. Or a teacher says, what is a pen? I can just go, pen. Or envelope. What is an envelope? And I have an envelope to hand. A very good way of teaching nouns in particular is realia, showing students the thing itself. Secondly, and obviously, dictionaries. Dictionaries are great. I love dictionaries. Dictionaries are very useful tools. Authentic real items. Absolutely, yeah. That's what realia is, exactly that. Really. Dictionaries. Dictionaries are really useful tools. Monolingual English to English dictionaries seem like hard work at first, but can be really useful in expanding your vocabulary. Or English to your own language. Bilingual dictionaries can also be very useful things. And then there is the value of translation. There's a lot of discussion about the value of translation in English in language teaching generally. Some people say, no, you should only use English all the time to explain everything. Other people think, well, actually, no, using translation and speaking some in your own language, in your what we call your L1 and the L2 can be a really useful way of learning a language. Sometimes translation is very, very useful for explaining meaning. These are all the key things to think about when you're teaching the meaning of a word. Next slide. Okay, that's about meaning, what words are there for now. But words exist as kind of as things as well, don't they? Either as written on a piece of paper or a computer screen or in a book or as spoken objects. And each word has its own particular form. we can talk about form in two different ways. We talk about morphological form, which is really the written forms of the word, what it looks like, its shape on the page, how it is spelt, how it can change by adding affixes, how it can change by putting it next to or together with other words. That's the morphological form of the word. And words also have a phonological form, that is how they are pronounced, how we say them and how they sound when we hear them. So when we're thinking about the form of a word, think in terms of morphology and phonology. Let's look at these things a little bit more carefully. Firstly, in terms of that morphological form, spelling. Spelling is important. Even though if we're writing on our computers, we might have a handy spell check, which will correct things for us, or an autocorrect even. Spelling is still very important. The morphological form is made up of a number of letters, 1, 2, 3, 4, or more letters. Getting those letters in the right order is something that seems very simple. It is, but is very, very important. How can we help our students with the spelling? Know the names of the letters: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z, all those 26 letters. Make sure we know the names of them. So when we're telling somebody how to spell a word, we can say T-A-B-L-E. When to capitalize, okay? In English, those letters have what we call a lowercase, the small form, and the uppercase, the big form. And we sometimes use those capital letters, knowing when a word should be capitalized, if it's at the beginning of the sentence, or if it's what we call a proper noun, that is the name of something. We need to know what the plural forms look like. Now, we know in English, most plural forms are easy. Add an S to the spelling. There are a few irregular plurals, not many, fortunately, but I'm sure you know some of them, child and children, mouse and mice, but know how to spell those plural forms. Common patterns and complications, by which mean a lot of words in English follow the same pattern, okay? A lot of nouns end in T-I-O-N, a lot of adjectives end in Y, nearly all adverbs end in L-Y. Sometimes there are complications, as we'll see, where the same group of letters can be pronounced in different ways. If I think of the words through and tough, for example, they are both spelled O-U-G-H at the end, but pronounced in different ways. So also something to be aware of when we're thinking about spelling. And also regional variations, that is the difference between, mostly, let's say, the difference between British and American English, where there are different spelling conventions. When we're thinking about morphological form, think about spelling. We also need to think about affixation. Again, this is another technical term, but a useful term to think about what happens when we put something at the beginning of a word or at the end of a word. So we have the base word, which can be affixed with either a prefix, something that becomes at the beginning of the word, or a suffix, that is something we put at the end of the word. To give you an example here, we can have our base word, which might be happy, and then with a prefix, it becomes unhappy. In this case, that prefix un, which makes something its opposite or its negative. Or some words can have both a prefix and a suffix. So we can get to unhappiest. So we get to that st, a suffix, which makes something the superlative, meaning the most of something. So that's how we get from what we call the base word, adding a prefix and then adding both a prefix and a suffix to change the meaning of that base word. Another example of this might be if we take the verb to obey. as our base word, then it can be, you change the meaning with the prefix disobey, and then change the meaning again with the suffix disobedience. This also changes the part of speech. It goes from being a verb into an adjective. Okay, affixation, prefixes and suffixes. Compounding. In English, sometimes we stick two words together to make a slightly different word. We have two base words which we put together to make a different word. For example, words can change their meaning slightly. We can have the word book, which we know, the word shop. If we put them together, we get a bookshop, which is something slightly different from those two base words. But we can see the connection here very easily. Another example might be phone, the word phone, and the word number. Both have their own meanings, but when we put them together, we get a phone number, which again is something slightly different. Interesting thing here, unusual thing, when with compound words, it's important to note, sometimes they become one word, as in bookshop. Sometimes, even though it's what we call a compound noun, they are written as two words, like phone number. Here's another one that might be more familiar to you over the last few years. Lock and down make lockdown, something we probably most of us will have experienced. Okay, that's an example of what's called a compound noun, and the process is called compounding. Okay, those are the most important things to think about when you think about the morphology, the shape of the word, how it looks on the page. But as I said, form is also about sound, when we say the words and when we listen to the words. Phonological. Words in English are divided into syllables, a certain number of syllables, and certain syllables are stressed and certain syllables are unstressed. So for example, I'm going to show you some words. Here are 4 words, and I'd just like you to think for a moment about how you pronounce these words. How do we say these words? Most importantly, where is the stress on these words? I've chosen these 4 words because they're ones which students, in my experience, sometimes have problems with. Let's have a look. Here's a word, necessary. This is a word which has 4 syllables, necessary. We put the stress on the first syllable. We don't say necessary, we don't say necessary, we don't say necessary. We say necessary. Again, with this one. 4 syllables again, and again the stress is on the first syllable. Interesting, not interesting, not interesting, not interesting, but interesting. Stress. Now, here's a tricky one, because some words, not many, but some words can have what we call shifting stress or changing stress. That is, this word can be pronounced in 2 different ways. Content, which means what is inside something, the contents of a book or the contents of your bag, for example. But if we put the stress on the second syllable, content, then it becomes an adjective, which means happy, content. This is similar. Protest is a verb meaning to argue against something. Protest is protest is the noun, which means a demonstration to say that something is wrong or you do not agree with it. Protest is the verb, meaning to act, to make an action against something or to express that you don't like something, to protest. Okay, so think about word stress. Think about how many syllables the word has, which syllable is stress, but also be aware of changing stress and how this can change meaning. Most words in English, as a help, have 2 syllables and the stress is on the first syllable. That's a useful thing to remember. In terms of phonology, this is about the pronunciation. Now, I find pronunciation fascinating, and there will be a unit coming up on pronunciation later on. But in terms of words, it's always useful to know exactly how a word is pronounced. How many, because in English, as we know, the relationship between the sound and the spelling is not always simple. A word can have a number of letters, but only a different number of sounds. Certain groups of letters make sounds. So it's important to know about how a word is pronounced using the phonetic alphabet like this. The phonetic alphabet is a very useful tool for teachers, and I strongly recommend you get to know it if you don't know it already. Necessary, interesting, content, protest or protest. When thinking about the phonological form of the word, know how many sounds or phonemes there are in that word. Phonology. Next one. Okay, so that's thinking about the forms of the word, the morphological and the phonological forms of the word. Words to help us as teachers and to help us as learners and learners teachers can be divided into different groups. We're going to look at some of these now. The idea of the lexical set and how it differs from the word family, collocations, which was mentioned before, thank you. The idea of chunks, synonyms, antonyms, false friends, homophones, homonyms, idioms, and different varieties. Okay, so we're going to spend the next 15 minutes looking through these groups of words. Firstly, the lexical set. I'm going to give you an example. This is an example of what we call a lexical set. Desk, chair, laptop, lamp, books, notebooks, pens, pencils, envelopes. This is what we call a lexical set, and the name of this lexical set could be something as simple as things in an office, things we find in an office. So quite simply, a lexical set is words for things which often go together. For example, I'm sitting in my office now and I'm looking around and I'm seeing there's a desk, there's my chair, I'm talking to you on a laptop, there's a lamp. These are all things that I see around me. They're words that are usefully grouped together. If you have students who are working in an office or in a classroom or whatever, teaching them by means of the lexical set, words which go together, is a useful thing to think about. Another example might be a simpler one, perhaps. Football, cricket, basketball, athletics, snowboarding, rowing. This is simply a lexical set of sports. Your students will probably enjoy playing certain sports, and it's a good idea to group these all by the means of what we call the lexical set. Okay. Now, another group, as well as the lexical set, there's what's called the word family, which is not quite the same. It might sound similar, but it's not quite the same. The word family suggests that all these words are related by the same base word or the same root word. Some examples here. It's by adding prefixes and suffixes and derivations, we can see that all these words are in the same family. Office, official, unofficial, officially, unofficially, officious. Sport, sporting, sporty, sportsperson, sports fair, unsporty. Word families, you can see they have the same DNA in the same way as a human family. We might have the same nose or the same ears as our parents or our children. These words in the same family have the same roots, the same things going on. The word family. Okay. Next one, collocations. This is what was mentioned before. Now then, collocations are very useful things. Collocations are words which are friends, words which like to hang out with each other, we could say, words which like to spend time with each other, words which commonly go together. Have lunch, take a shower, heavy rain, cold weather, tasty food, read a book. Collocations are very useful in helping us see how words fit together and helping us build from knowing some words to putting those words together to develop longer sentences and longer discourses, longer pieces of language, collocations, words which commonly go together. There are what are called strong collocations and weak collocations, words which go together almost always, and words which go together less commonly. So for example, here, I think tasty food is a strong collocation because tasty doesn't describe many other things apart from food. Cold weather is a good collocation, but cold can obviously describe lots of things and not only the weather. Similar to collocations and building from the idea of collocations is the idea of what are sometimes called chunks. Chunks. Now, chunks is quite a vague definition in some ways, but chunks are what are sometimes called fixed phrases, things we often say. These are very, very useful for language learners. You get a whole group of words together and to make a phrase which is commonly used, sounds very natural, sounds very authentic, and can be used in lots of different contexts. For example, I'd like to. Now then, we could look at this in terms of the grammar and think about would like and the contractions, but sometimes it's useful just to tell students this is what you say when you want something or we have a desire or a need. I'd like to watch TV. I'd like to stay in tonight. I'd like to learn how to speak Uzbek. I'd like to visit Uzbekistan one day. How about is a use on their own? How and about don't really seem to make much sense, but how about if we think of this as a way of suggesting something? How about learning English? How about doing some homework? How about doing an exercise? How about is a chunk we use to suggest something. Have you ever, to ask about experiences? My name is, get something done, hard at work. More than collocations, words which commonly go together. That might have a different meaning individually, but once placed all together, they have a particular function. Chunks. Next, synonyms and antonyms. That is, words which mean the same kind of thing and words which are the opposites. This is a very useful way of teaching vocabulary, a useful way of telling people what things mean. There are words which mean the same thing. For example, if we take a base word, happy, synonyms might include content, we just looked at, pleased, okay, easygoing, happy. These are words which mean more or less the same thing as happy. They are different ways of saying happy. If we can use synonyms to help our students, it's a very good way of expanding their vocabulary. We don't have to depend on translation all the time. We can give them other words which mean the same thing. So there are synonyms, and then there are antonyms. That is, each word, well, not every word, but many words have an opposite. Happy, sad, or unhappy, or discontent. But happy and sad, what we would call antonyms, a word and its opposites. Again, this can be useful in teaching. If a student says, what does sad mean? You can say it's the opposite of happy. Happy, which is quite a low-level word, a word many people will know. Synonyms, antonyms, words which mean the same things, opposites. Well, okay, those are very common groups and good common ways of thinking about vocabulary or lexics. There are some less common groups. One of these is words we call false friends. Now, false friends differ from language to language, and I am afraid I do not speak any Uzbek at all. I don't know any Uzbek, so I don't know what false friends there might be in your language. But let me explain the idea of false friends. False friends are words which look like they are similar to words in your language, but are not quite the same. For example, there's the word gentle in English, which means to do with physical strength. If you do something gently, you do it slowly, calmly, softly, easily. You can talk in a gentle way. You can do something gentle. It's about touch and holding things. However, in many other languages, the word gentle, from a same root in Latin, means polite or well educated. In English, in contemporary English, in modern English, it doesn't really have this meaning. Another one is parents, for example. In English, my parents are your mother and father. In another language, in a language I know, Italian, for example, your parenti are all your family, your relations. Not only your mother and father, but your uncle and your auntie and your great uncle and your niece and your nephew. All these people are your parenti, but they're not your parents. So they're words which look like they mean the same thing, but don't. Another example might be sympathetic. In other languages, there are words similar to this that mean something like friendly or easygoing or likable. Whereas sympathetic in English has a rather different and more specific meaning. Sympathetic is when you understand somebody else's difficulties or pain. It's a much more restricted use. I don't know if there are any false friends in respect. There might be, there might not be, but it's a useful thing to remember when we're thinking about lexes. False friends. Homophones. I like homophones. English is a language which has lots and lots of different roots. It's a mixed language. It's a hybrid language, a language which is taken from Latin and French and German and Norse and African, some African languages and Indian languages and lots of things, which means that, well, one of the reasons for that, that's one of the reasons we have this complicated sound spelling relationship, which results in things like homophones, which are simply, from the Greek, same sound. Two words which have the same sound, and if we think about that morphology, in terms of the pronunciation, they're exactly the same, but a different spelling and a different meaning. For example, here are some. CC, hair, blue. But I've made a mistake though, excuse me. I've made two mistakes on that thing. I've only just noticed that. So C and C, you can see the C. Hair, my hair is an animal like a rabbit. This should be blue, the color, and blue, B-L-E-W, the past of blow. Steel, meaning to, and steel, I wanted to write S-T-E-E-L, the metal, steel. My apologies. This is why homophones is important to be aware of homophones, because they can cause problems in writing sometimes. And I am the example of that. I've just made a mistake. My apologies. Homophones are, there are homophones. There are also homonyms. Homonyms, now then, these are a word which is almost the opposite, a word which is written the same and pronounced the same, but can have a different meaning. Fortunately, there aren't that many of these in English, but they can be confusing for students. For example, post. We know what post, you can get a letter in the post. We have postal workers and postal deliveries and the post office is the post, but a post can also mean a piece of wood or metal in the ground, like a lamp post. Posts can have two very, very different meanings. A post, a piece of wood in the ground, a lamp post, or post to deliver a letter. Bank, we know what a bank is. Bank is where you keep your money, or the people who keep your money from, keep your money with you. Bank, money, banking. But bank also means, for example, the side of a river. If you go, you might take a walk along the river bank. Or if you go to Paris, you'll be on the left bank or the right bank of the River Seine. Side of a river or a place to keep your money. Same word, completely different meaning. This gets even more complicated with a few other words, like the next one, which can have a different pronunciation despite the same spelling. There can be a row. You might have your students seated in rows, meaning lines of something. A row meaning a line of something. Or if we change the pronunciation to row, it's when you have an argument with somebody. A row is an argument. Same spelling, different pronunciation, different meaning. And again, this one, bow, which might be what you tie in your shoes, or if you have a tie, you might tie it in a bow. Or if you pronounce it bow, it's what you do when you meet the Queen. Bow when you meet the Queen. Homonyms, quite rare, but useful to remember, particularly the more common ones. Next up, idioms. Idioms are lovely things. There are many in English. This is when the literal meaning of the words doesn't match with the figurative meanings. So, for example, if I say we've got all our ducks in a row, it means what I'm saying is that everything is prepared, everything is ready, we are good to go, everything is, before you go in to teach a class, you should have your lesson plan ready. You can say, I've got all my ducks in a row. Everything's lined up, prepared, ready to go. It's not actually about ducks. If you feel like a fish out of water, it means you feel like you are in the wrong place. You're doing the wrong thing. You're in the wrong environment or situation. If you've been studying English for donkey's years, this is a good example of an idiom which is very difficult, almost impossible to work out the meaning of. A fish out of water, perhaps you could guess that this is a person who is in the wrong environment, but donkey's years means simply a long time, a long time. If I say teaching is my bread and butter, it doesn't mean I eat it. What it means is it's my job. It's what I do, my bread and butter. It's how I make my money, my bread and butter. So an idiom is an example of when the literal meaning doesn't make sense. Words which have a figurative meaning. They are fixed phrases that we can't really change. Idioms. Next up, okay, then there are regional variations. English has lots and lots of varieties across the world. There is Australian English and New Zealand English and South African English and Indian English. There is Canadian English. There are most of the most common variations are the US variations and the UK variations. The UK simply because for historical reasons, and the US one simply because it's the biggest English-speaking, most powerful country with the reach of television and radio and everything. And so it's important to know the distinctions between some of these regional variations. Some of them we probably know. The US word is the UK word is a pavement. The US word is a sidewalk. The US word is an elevator. Here in the UK, we have a lift. Okay, so there are sometimes just different words for things between British and American English. There are also different spelling conventions, which I mentioned right at the beginning when we looked at spelling. These aren't huge, but there are some. The most notable one is that the US leaves out the U in words like colour. They spell it COLOR, whereas in British English, we put a U in, and that goes the same for favour and favourites, and other words like that. Also, the Z's to the S's in UK English, we will spell it generalise with an S. US English puts a Z into it. Differences between British and American English and other regional variations. Okay, that's all. So now we've thought about form, and we thought about meaning, and we thought about groups. That's everything there is to know about a word. Now then, in Alan's book, which I don't know if you have, Alan's very useful, very good book. This book, he suggests doing this for every word. I think this is on page 17, if you've got the book. So for each word you come across, here we have the example of clear. You can write its denotative meanings. You can make a list of its synonyms, its antonyms, which part of a lexical set it is, which part of a how it forms parts of a word family, if it has any homophones or homonyms, if there are any false friends, what prefixes it can take, what suffixes it can take, what compounds and collocations it has. Now, we could do that for every single word, go through all of these categories that we've thought of. And that is what it might be to know a word. However, it would take a long time to do that, to write this kind of a list for every single word, because as we just saw, there are a million words in the English language. And even if we only use the 30,000 commonly used or the 5,000 in everyday use, it would take a long time to think of the denotative and connotative meanings of the synonyms and antonyms of lexical sets, families, homophones, homonyms for each one of those words. But so I'm not suggesting that you must do this for every single word. What I am suggesting is that these are useful things to be aware of. And if you are teaching a vocabulary lesson with particular words, you should be aware of all these things. Yeah, it can be very useful. It can help you know the word and all its uses. Knowing a word is a bit like knowing a person. The more time you spend with a word, the more you get to know them. Okay, so that's all the theory. That's what words are. How do we teach them? Main principles are exposure. Give your students a chance to see and hear the words as much as possible. Consolidation. Use the words again and again and again and again. If you use the words again and the students have the chance to see the words in different contexts, it helps them to consolidate their understanding of it. Focus. Really look at the word carefully, as in that table we've seen before. Look carefully at the word's form, how it is spelled, how it is pronounced, what other forms it can have, which words it is friends with, looking at the word very carefully. Extension, how this word can be used in other contexts. Okay, again, the idea of a word being like a friend is useful. The more you get to know them, you spend more time with them, you get to know them better, you look at them very carefully, you see what they're like in different contexts. Exposure, consolidation, focus, extension. Some activities to teach Lexis. Okay, now here's the thing, that it doesn't seem to be teaching as such, but it's been discovered by lots and lots of researchers that the best way for students or learners to increase their vocabulary, to have a greater awareness of Lexis, is to do lots of reading, extended reading. So that's not just very short pieces, but reading articles on magazines or books. Making sure your students have access to texts in English that they can read as far as you possibly can. Encouraging them to read. Thinking of activities you can do around reading groups, reading clubs, reviews, discussions based on things that they've read. Motivating students to read. Really good way of learning vocabulary. At a different level, there is the classic exercise, the gap fill. There are lots of different ways of doing these. I'm sure you must know them. It's when there is a text, there are some words missing. Students have to write in the correct word. These can be made more easy or more difficult if you give them the words they should put in the wrong order. If the words are all grouped. We'll look more at this later about when we're thinking about designing activities, but the gap fill is a good way of working and teaching vocabulary. Drilling is quite a good word. It's quite a good activity, particularly for pronunciation. Drilling is when we get the whole class to say something all together, particularly with some of those words, I think, that are difficult to pronounce. interesting, interesting. Everybody in the class says interesting, interesting, all together like a chant. Drilling can be really useful. Translation, again, the status of translation is much discussed, how much of English we should use in our class, how much of our first language we should use in the class. But sometimes translation can be really useful in helping students to understand, particularly when we're thinking about the semantics, the meanings of words. This is something, an old activity, but always a good one. What I still call the vocab notebook. When I was learning languages at school, we all had a small notebook, perhaps just one like this, a really little one. And every time you come across a new word or a word you think is useful or interesting, you write it in the notebook. Keep it in a notebook. Have a special small notebook. Special small notebook in which to write new words, and then when you have time you go back, you write down the word, you write down how it's pronounced, you can write down an example of this word in a sentence. Really, really useful thing to have, a vocabulary notebook. Okay, this is one other argument about how to teach vocabulary. Before we read or listen to a text, we tell the students what we think are the difficult words in that passage, which is called pre-teaching, giving students the vocabulary before they read or do an activity. On the other hand, some teachers say this isn't good. What we should do is just give the students the text or let them listen to something and see if they can understand the words from their context, from the place they are in the sentence, from the greater text that they're in. Pre-teaching and dealing with emerging languages that appears in context. Conclusions. That about brings us to the end. There's been a lot of information in this session. I'm aware of that. There's a lot of input. I hope you've got a lot out of this. As I say, yeah, lots of information, all about words. Think about shape, form, how to use them and how to teach them. What conclusions have you got? I'd like to know if you've learned anything today, or just I think we've got 5 minutes left. 4 or 5 minutes left. If anybody's got any questions, please do put them in the chat. Questions, comments, anything at all. Okay. Right. Well, if there are no questions, I will finish here. I'd like to say thank you for listening this morning. I hope it's all been useful. I know there's a lot of input. Alan will be back with you next week. I will see you again, I think, in 2 or 3 weeks' time. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Okay, I'd like to thank once more Chris Rose for a very wonderful and informative webinar. And dear teachers, if you have any questions, you're always welcome to ask. Do we have any questions from participants? So if you can always email us, or you can always send us